The Whispering Walls. Sophie had always wanted to travel, so when she landed an au pair job in a remote French countryside estate, she thought she had struck gold. The family, Jean-Luc and Marie Dubois, seemed welcoming enough, and their 6-year-old daughter, Elise, was an angel. But from the moment Sophie set foot in the house, she felt something was off. The house was old, its wooden beams groaning at night. The air smelled musty, as if the walls held onto something they refused to release. The strangest thing? Elise's constant whispering. She would murmur to the walls, nodding as if someone was speaking back. At first, Sophie thought it was just a child's imagination, but then the whispers started coming from inside the walls. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard soft voices, not Elise's, low, urgent, overlapping whispers. She pressed her ear against the cold wooden wall and felt an unsettling chill creep through her skin. Help us. She's still here. She never left. Sophie jerked back, her heart hammering. She rushed to Elise's room, only to find the girl sitting up in bed, staring at the wall, her lips moving soundlessly. Elise, Sophie whispered. Who are you talking to? Elise turned to her, her wide blue eyes filled with something unreadable. The lady in the walls. She's angry. Sophie felt ice creep up her spine. That night she barely slept. The whispers continued, growing louder. The next day, she confronted Marie about it. The woman's face went pale. You're imagining things, she said quickly, brushing off Sophie's concerns. But the way her hands trembled betrayed her. That evening, Sophie did some research. The house was over 200 years old, once belonging to a noble family that had perished mysteriously. There were stories, whispers of a woman who had been bricked inside the walls as punishment. Sophie couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, as the house groaned in the wind, she followed the whispers to the basement. The walls were old stone, cracked and crumbling. Then she saw it. A small gap in the wall, where something white and delicate protruded, a bone. The moment she touched it, a blood-curdling scream filled the basement, shaking the walls. Sophie ran, but as she turned, she saw Elise standing at the top of the stairs, her small voice whispering, "She doesn't want you here." Sophie packed her bags that night. The Dubois family never spoke of what she found, but before she left, Elise whispered one last thing. She only comes for the ones who listen. Sophie tried to forget what she had seen, the bone, the whispering, Elise's chilling words. But something about the house clung to her, like invisible fingers trailing over her skin. She wanted to leave, but something held her back. Maybe it was the way Elise looked at her small hands gripping her wrist when she tucked her in at night. Maybe it was the way Marie avoided eye contact, her lips pursed in something between fear and guilt. Or maybe it was the whispers. They didn't stop. At night, they crawled through the cracks in the walls, growing louder. Sophie could almost understand them now. Begging, pleading, warning. And then Elise started to change. Her bright blue eyes dulled, dark circles forming beneath them. She barely ate. She rarely spoke. But when she did, she would whisper, "She's waking up." Sophie demanded answers. "Who is she, Elise?" Elise shivered. "The lady in the walls. She doesn't like when people find her bones." That night, Sophie locked her door. She didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., the walls trembled. The whispers turned into moans. Then, into screams. Sophie bolted upright as the door slammed open. Elise stood there, her nightgown soaked in sweat, her eyes blank. "She's coming," the girl whispered. The light flickered. The walls groaned. Then, the shadows in the corner of the room began to shift. Something was crawling out. Sophie stood frozen as the thing crawled out of the darkness. It was a woman, or what was left of one. Her body was twisted, her limbs too long, her face a rotting mask of agony. The flesh on her hands had been scraped away, leaving behind jagged bone, as if she had clawed her way out from the walls. Elise didn't scream. She just whispered, "She's finally free." The thing lurched forward. Sophie grabbed Elise and ran. The hallways felt endless. The walls pulsed like something was breathing. The whispers turned into shrieks. Sophie reached the front door, locked. Behind her, the thing dragged itself closer, leaving a wet, dark trail across the wooden floor. "Sophie," the voice came from inside her head. It wasn't Elise. It wasn't Marie. It was her. Sophie turned. The woman was inches away. Her hollow eyes burned into Sophie's soul. Her lips cracked open. "Let me in." The house shook. The walls split open. And then, everything went black. Sophie woke up outside, lying in the damp grass. Marie was screaming. Elise was crying. The house was gone. Collapsed in on itself, as if it had never existed. The only thing left? A single bone sticking out from the rubble. Elise whispered one last thing before they left. She's still inside, waiting for the next one. It had been a year since Sophie left the house that collapsed on itself, since the whispers stopped, since Elise and Marie disappeared, moving away without a trace. But Sophie still heard her. In her small apartment, she'd wake up at night to the sound of something scraping against the walls. The whispers came back, soft at first, then louder. Then one night she found something outside her door, a small, brittle bone, and a note in a child's handwriting. "You shouldn't have left her." Sophie stared at it, her pulse hammering. From inside the walls, something laughed, and then a whisper in her ear. "I found you." Sophie knew she couldn't run anymore. The whispers had followed her for too long. She had to go back. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and her racing heartbeat, she returned to the site of the collapsed house. Only, it wasn't collapsed anymore. It was standing, exactly as she remembered it. The front door was open. Sophie stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. The walls were breathing. The house knew she was back. And then, Elise's voice, weak, crying. "Sophie, help me." Sophie ran to the little girl's room, her heart pounding. She was there, but Elise didn't look right. Her body was pale, her hair tangled, her eyes black as coal. "You left me," Elise whispered. Sophie took a step back. "You left me behind." Elise's lips peeled back into a grin, and from the walls, the woman crawled out. Sophie screamed. The last thing she saw was rotting hands reaching for her. The house swallowed her whole. The next day, the land was empty again, like the house had never been there. And Sophie, she was never seen again. Story 2. The Watcher in the Window. Lena took an au pair job in a wealthy London townhouse to care for 2 boys, Henry and Oliver. The job was easy enough, but the house felt too quiet. The boys were strangely reserved, and their parents were always away. The worst part? The window in her room. It faced an alleyway where an old, abandoned building stood. At night, she could feel eyes on her. She tried to ignore it, but every night when she looked, there was someone standing in the window across from hers, a woman in white with hollow eyes. Lena told herself it was her imagination, but the presence felt too real. She began closing her curtains at night, but each morning they would be open again. Then the boys started whispering about the lady in the window. "She watches you," Henry said. "She doesn't like strangers." Lena's unease grew. One night, she woke up to a tapping sound. Her curtains were open. The woman in white was closer now, standing at the edge of the alley, staring up at her. Lena froze. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. Then, she heard the floorboards creak behind her. She turned slowly. There was someone in the room. A figure, pale and hunched, stood in the corner. It let out a low, shuddering breath. Lena screamed. The lights flicked on, and the figure was gone. The next morning, she demanded to know what was happening. The family's housekeeper finally broke down. A previous au pair, she vanished. No one knows where she went, but Henry and Oliver kept seeing her in the window after she disappeared. Lena quit that day, but before she left, she checked one last time. The woman in white was there, watching, smiling. Lena packed her bags, determined to leave by morning. But morning never came. At least, not in the way she expected. She woke up to a scraping sound outside her window. It was still dark. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. 3:27 a.m. She didn't want to look, but she did. The woman in white was closer, standing directly outside her window. Except that wasn't possible. Her room was on the 3rd floor. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The woman's head tilted, her mouth stretching too wide, her eyes empty, pits of black. A faint sound drifted through the glass. Knock, knock, knock. Lena scrambled back. Her bedroom door burst open. Oliver stood there, his small face pale, his lip trembling. "You have to hide," he whispered. "She's inside now." Something moved in the shadows behind him. Lena grabbed the boy and ran. The hallways shifted around them, elongating, twisting like a maze. The walls groaned as if they were alive. A whisper slithered down the corridor. "You let me in." Lena turned the corner, dragging Oliver into a closet, slamming the door shut. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps. Footsteps dragged across the wooden floor outside. Then, the voice whispered again, from the other side of the door. "I see you." Lena pressed her ear against the closet door. Silence. Then, creak. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Something sniffed the air outside the closet. Lena's pulse hammered in her ears. Oliver gripped her wrist so tight his nails dug into her skin. Then came the whisper, "Come out now." Lena didn't move. The handle turned. Oliver whimpered. The door swung open. Nothing was there. The hallway was empty. The house was still. But Lena knew better. She grabbed Oliver and bolted down the stairs. The front door was wide open. The alleyway was pitch black. But the woman in white was there, standing in the distance, waiting. Lena hesitated for only a second. Then, Oliver's small hand slipped from hers. She turned. He was gone. A single whisper drifted through the air. "Mine now," Lena screamed. But there was no one left to hear it. Lena never stopped looking for Oliver. She told the police everything, but the house where she worked as an au pair was suddenly empty. The family was gone. No records, no forwarding address. As if they had never existed. But Lena knew the truth. Because every night she'd see him, standing outside her window. Not a little boy anymore, not Oliver. Just something wearing his face, and every night it got closer. Until one evening, Lena heard it whisper through the glass, "You let me in." Her lights flickered, the window latch unlocked by itself, and then the door behind her creaked open. Lena had to end it. She couldn't let it take her. The thing wearing Oliver's face was in her apartment now. It stood at the end of her bed, staring. Its face stretched too wide, eyes empty, pits of black. "You let me in," it whispered. Lena didn't run. She grabbed the iron poker from her fireplace and swung. But the thing didn't flinch. It just laughed. The lights exploded. The shadows swallowed the walls. And then, cold hands wrapped around Lena's throat. "You should have stayed with us," it hissed. Lena's scream was cut short. The next morning, her apartment was empty. Only the open window remained. And outside, standing in the alleyway, the thing watched, waiting for someone new. Story 3. The Doll in the Nursery. Mia arrived at an isolated Victorian mansion in Scotland to care for a little girl named Emily. The house was grand, but lifeless. Emily was withdrawn, only ever speaking to her doll, a grotesque old porcelain doll with hollow black eyes. "Her name is Daisy," Emily whispered. "She protects me." At first, Mia played along, but strange things started happening. The doll would be in different places even though no one touched it. At night, Mia swore she heard tiny footsteps outside her room. Then came the laughter, high-pitched, not Emily's. One night, Mia woke to a sharp, giggling sound. The doll sat at the foot of her bed. It was smiling. Mia tried to throw Daisy away. She took it deep into the woods and buried it. That night, she woke up to a whisper. "You shouldn't have done that." She turned to see Emily holding Daisy. Her porcelain face cracked, but her smile wider. "She came back," Emily said, her voice eerily calm. Mia ran. She never went back. But sometimes, she dreams of the doll, and in those dreams, Daisy is still watching. Mia wanted to believe it was a nightmare, that Daisy the doll hadn't really moved, that Emily wasn't speaking to something that wasn't there. But then, Emily started drawing things, dark, twisted figures, a woman with black holes for eyes, a little girl holding hands with something that had no face. Mia found the last drawing under Emily's pillow. It was her, standing at the foot of Emily's bed, and behind her, something was watching. That night, the air felt wrong. Mia woke up gasping, the weight of something pressing on her chest. She couldn't move. Then, she felt tiny hands wrap around her wrist. "Don't fight," a small voice whispered. She managed to turn her head. Emily was sitting beside her. Her eyes were all black, and in her lap, Daisy. The doll grinned, her once cracked porcelain face perfectly smooth. Mia tried to scream. A cold hand clamped over her mouth, and then everything went black. Mia couldn't move. Something held her down, something cold, heavy, invisible. Emily's black eyes stared. Daisy the doll sat in her lap, her cracked mouth curving into a grin. "You shouldn't have left her in the woods," Emily whispered. Mia struggled, but she felt hands, small, countless hands, gripping her arms, her legs, her throat. "You have to stay now," Emily said. The doll tilted its head. Then Mia sank into darkness. She woke up in the nursery. The room was different, older, the wallpaper peeling, the air thick with dust. The crib in the corner was rocking itself. Mia pushed herself up. Her reflection in the nursery mirror was wrong. Her skin was pale. Her eyes were all black. And in her lap sat Daisy. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. From the hallway, Emily's voice whispered, "Now you're her doll." The nursery door slammed shut, and then darkness. Mia woke up screaming. For a moment, she thought she was still trapped in the nursery, stuck in that awful place with the doll. But she was in her own apartment, her own bed. She let out a shaky breath. Just a nightmare. Then, she saw it. Sitting in the chair across from her bed, Daisy. The doll she had left behind. The doll that should have been gone. Its porcelain face was cracked, its eyes glassy and dark. A small, childlike voice whispered from the shadows, "Play with me." The doll's head twitched. Mia tried to scream, but Daisy was already crawling toward her. Mia was trapped. Daisy sat on her bed, waiting. Its small porcelain fingers twitched. Mia knew she had to destroy it. She grabbed the doll, ran to the kitchen, and threw it into the fire. The flames roared, and a scream split the air. A horrible, inhuman wail. The lights flickered. And then, the house was silent. Mia collapsed to the floor, her hands shaking. It was over, or so she thought. That night, as she lay in bed, something brushed her face. She opened her eyes. Daisy was there, charred, broken, grinning. "You can't get rid of me," it whispered. Mia's final scream was swallowed by the dark. This concludes 3 disturbing true au pair horror stories. Do you dare to close your eyes tonight? Or will something be waiting for you in the dark?